You're tuning in to Unorthodoxing, the political talk show where uncommon politics finds common ground. Every week, you'll get news analysis from Mike Vick, an activist in the progressive pro-life movement, with 20 years of experience in politics and journalism, as well as interviews with outside-the-mainstream guests you won't see on the nightly news. Get ready for an unorthodox experience. Welcome, friends, to the second episode of Unorthodoxing. We have a packed show for you today, so I'll dive right in. We brought you an interview with Terrisa Bukovinac of progressive anti-abortion Uprising. As promised, Terrisa joined other pro-life activists in Memphis on December 3rd through December 5th. On the 5th, police arrested 17 activists for blockading the doors of the Planned Parenthood in Memphis. Terrisa was among those arrested, as was former Constitution Party presidential candidate Randall Terry, who founded Operation Rescue. Two activists convicted of FACE Act violations who were pardoned by President Trump, Joan Andrews Bell and John Henshaw, were also among the arrested activists. I plan to interview Elise Ketch, one of the activists who was arrested in Memphis, next week. Elise co-authored the book Rebuilding Pro-Life Nonviolence. We'll bring you Elise's interview as soon as possible. In the meantime, you can find a link to her work in the show notes. Although Tennessee's law protects most preborn children from abortion, pro-life activists have raised the alarm that the Memphis Planned Parenthood continues to refer for out-of-state abortions, assists with travel costs, and transports minors across state lines for abortions. The protest drew media attention, and not all of it was positive as you might expect. An article from the pro-choice publication Ms. Magazine decried the Trump administration's decision to stop enforcing the FACE Act. As Terrisa noted in our interview last week, FACE provided for federal prison time for blocking abortion facilities, which broke the back of the original iteration of Rescue back in the 80s and 90s. Rescue Resurrection is a joint operation largely spearheaded by Terrisa, progressive anti-abortion Uprising, and Randall Terry. The group is organizing its next actions in Washington, D.C. on January 21st and 22nd, and plans to organize a National Day of Rescue on January 22nd at locations around the country. You can learn more about Rescue Resurrection as well as RSVP for future events at rescueresurrection.com. And you'll find that link in the show notes. Now, on to our next story. U.S. lawmakers have condemned the Trump administration's seizure of a Venezuelan oil tanker off that nation's coast on Wednesday. President Trump confirmed the seizure, calling it one of the largest ones ever seized, and stating, quote, "We keep the oil, I guess," unquote. Attorney General Pam Bondi said the seizure was executed with a warrant on a vessel that had been transporting sanctioned oil from Venezuela and Iran, supporting foreign terrorist organizations. Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen condemned the seizure, arguing it proves the administration's stated mission of interdicting drugs is a, quote, "big lie," unquote, and that the real goal is regime change by force. Democratic Senator Chris Coons expressed grave concern that President Trump is sleepwalking us into a war with Venezuela. Republican Senator Rand Paul called the seizure a, quote, "initiation of war," unquote, and questioned the administration's aggressive posture. Democratic Senator Mark Warner suggested the actions show an inconsistency in priorities, questioning the ability to seize a tanker but not a drug boat. Venezuela's government denounced the seizure as a blatant theft and an act of international piracy, claiming the U.S. aggression is fundamentally about its oil and natural resources. The Trump administration has deployed its largest naval presence in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis to target quote-unquote narco-terrorists, despite reports suggesting fentanyl and cocaine enter the U.S. primarily through other routes. As I made clear last week, I'm in general quite skeptical of any justification for war. The Trump administration seems bent not only on provoking a war, but engaging in unconstitutional acts to achieve its probable aim of regime change in Venezuela. The power to make war rests with Congress. We've not had a declared war since World War II, but these actions off the coast of Venezuela have not even been granted the more dubiously constitutional method termed Authorization for Use of Military Force, or AUMF. The escalation led senators, including Adam Schiff and Rand Paul, to file a war powers resolution aimed at blocking the administration from military engagement with Venezuela without congressional approval. The War Powers Act is a federal law passed in 1973 intended to check the president's power to commit the United States to an armed conflict without the consent of Congress. It provides that the president can send the U.S. armed forces into action abroad by congressional statutory authorization or in case of national emergency created by an attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. The War Powers Act requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action and forbids armed forces from remaining for more than 60 days with a further 30-day withdrawal period without a congressional AUMF or a declaration of war. For my part, I pray that Congress succeeds in wresting its constitutional authority back from the executive branch. The American people must have the final say when it comes to military action, and polls suggest Americans are overwhelmingly opposed both to the Trump administration's actions off the coast of Venezuela and to any further escalation in the region. Now on to our interview segment. This week, you'll hear from Amar Patel, the American Solidarity Party's former vice presidential nominee and the current chair of the Illinois Solidarity Party. We recorded this interview earlier in the week. You noticed a color theme in my clothing, both in this segment and in the interview segment. That's intentional. The Solidarity Party's colors are orange, blue, and white, with orange reflecting the party's connection to Christian democratic parties, which have historically and globally used orange as a party color. So I wanted to represent my solidarity with the Solidarity Party as best I could. Well, Amar Patel, welcome to Unorthodoxing. For those who are following along, this is our second episode. Just a couple of acknowledgements. One, you are the current chair of the Illinois Solidarity Party, and I am the vice chair. So we have a close professional relationship. We also have a close personal relationship, at least I think so, in that we regularly chat over the phone, and you have even kindly had me stay at your house twice rather than make the long drive back to my place late at night after party events here in Illinois. I will further note that Amar was Brian Carroll's running mate on our party's presidential ticket in 2020. And before I even joined the Solidarity Party, Amar, you and I spoke on the phone for about a half hour. And I have to tell you that that was an indelible memory for me because I had been tangentially involved in third-party politics before. I'd, voted for Green Party candidates. I'd gone to a few events before, but I'd mostly been in the Democratic Party. And I can guarantee you I've never been on the phone with Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. I've been on Zoom calls before with Cornel West and Jill Stein of the Green Party, but I've never had a one-on-one conversation for any length of time with someone while they're running for high federal office like that. So being a new potential party member, even one who happened to be running for state level office as the endorsed candidate of the Democratic Party at the time, it was really cool for me as a political geek to get to chat at length with a vice presidential nominee. And your conversation with me then was a big part of why I joined the Solidarity Party. So I'll also note that your conversations with me since are a big part of why I'm still a member of the party, and your desire to welcome someone like me who is coming into the party from a much more leftist space than you were continues to inspire me to welcome people into the party from a variety of backgrounds. I really thank you for that. So take it away, Amar. Thank you again so much for joining me.
Thanks, Mike, for having me. I really appreciate being the second guest on your show. It is an honor to be recognized as someone that fits your space of unorthodox views, but that we're party ASP tangent, right? Like we're in the space of solidarity politics, and we're looking to build that the Christian democratic base into a more stronger and more robust political animal, I guess I would say. And so to answer your question about my background, when I was 18, the first election that I was allowed to vote in was in the Bill Clinton versus George Bush Sr., Herbert Walker Bush, in 1992. And so I had had a recent, relative to that time point, I had a conversion experience and had become very active in Christian faith. And simultaneous to that, I, through friends through the church that I was kind of doing most of my attendance and participation in, become very active in a pro-life perspective as well. So much so that several of the folks were involved in first Operation Rescue, nationally. And then they had started an organization, some people from the University of Illinois, called Collegians Activated to Liberate Life, CALL. I don't think that organization exists anymore, but it was basically Operation Rescue specifically for college students. And I had some great friends in there and, received a lot of information from them, saw I think it was the Silent Scream, which is an old video from the early 80s that showed like how an abortion actually happens, how it works, and what it looks like, and the devastation to the child and the destruction of physical tissue of a baby. And it changed me, right? Like it really took my faith and kind of focused it into a political space that I never really was part of. My parents were not political people overtly. And so that was the first time I really felt like, wow, this is going on in the world and I need to look into this and be active in it. And of course, right after I had turned 18, the election cycle had come out. And that was one of the first times where the life issue was like one of the top issues. I didn't know this being much younger in the Reagan years of politics, that he was known, and kind of looking back, that he was pro-life, but like that wasn't the hot button issue like it is these days. But that's a constant conversation. It was only recently that I learned that was the first election where that was a major issue, and it was for me, and that was pretty much my only issue. I was 18, I didn't really know much of anything else. I was in college. I was still learning about the world. I had my high school courses about U.S. history, but I'm not sure what your high school courses were like. But U.S. history for me in high school ended like at 1970. Like nothing happened after 1970, because that's as far as you would get in a course in high school in social studies with history. So I voted for Bush in '92. And stayed on that Republican cycle all the way through the Bush Jr. years and George W. But like in 2002, after 9/11, and we started attacking, we went to war in Afghanistan and we went to war in Iraq. And I started going like, what are we doing? I'm pro-life. That's why I'm voting for these candidates. But then I started looking at other issues, and I was then deeply involved in my Catholic faith and looking at Catholic social justice and thinking like there's not the complete picture here. There's something wrong here. When 2008 came around, I still was kind of like, okay, I still got to vote pro-life. When Donald Trump came into the picture, I lost all of my respect for the Republican Party, where we weren't even trying to say that character mattered, right? Like, and here's a person that never was pro-life. He was, quote, the most pro-life president later on, because, he showed up at a March for Life, but never in his life was he ever very active. In fact, I'm sure he was pro-choice when he was a Democrat for all those years in New York. That's where I think I first completely became politically homeless. And I was very actively involved in just online chat rooms about politics. One of the groups was called Catholic Political Geeks, and spent a lot of time there. So much so that I was invited to become one of the moderators, because I would have discussions, I'd engage in discussions and try to be respectful of different perspectives, right? And try to make my point, but not be antagonistic to people who disagreed with me. And I learned a lot from some folks, and some people that really made good arguments that I didn't agree with at the time. I really respected them as people who were thinking, who were thoughtful, respectful. And then I would message them privately. I'd become friends with them on Facebook and had phone calls and be like, you know what? Like, this person doesn't think like me, but like deep down, they kind of hold the core beliefs, especially about our faith, that make me think this is a good person that I want to know and understand, right? And that's, I think, where I first started to question some of my tribalistic thoughts that I had gotten from the Republican background that I had kind of pigeonholed myself into. And so I learned a lot about Catholic social teaching. I learned a lot about, the saints, their the Gospels, and the poor, and care for the poor and love of the poor is so central to the faith. And it wasn't being expressed in, Republican ideologues, right? And so that's kind of what happened. And I was having a back and forth. It wasn't in Catholic Political Geeks, but I was just having a discussion like, I wish there was more of a holistic party that went along with my beliefs. And Tai Chi Kuo very well, who is an Illinois Solidarity Party member and was on the national committee with myself. He reached out and sent a message saying, you should look into the American Solidarity Party. And I went to the website and looked at the platform, and I was like, oh my gosh, it was like a road to Emmaus moment, right? Like where things were opened up to me that I didn't think could all be, things went together in a way that I had never thought they could go together. And so that's kind of where I began my journey in the American Solidarity Party, and, became way more involved, end up on the vice presidential ticket. I mean, there's a lot more to that story.
I think that it'd be good for us to go into that, sort of what was going on in the party when you joined, because you obviously joined before I did. You learned about the party years before I even knew that it existed. I've only gotten, this history secondhand from many people who were involved at the time. So I'd love to hear a little more about that. I mean, you can start with what you know of the history before, you joined, but, go into some detail about how things progressed in your early time in the party,
Right.
And then go into sort of how you wound up on the ticket with Brian Carroll.
I joined in 2018. I think it was January, where I had met. Actually, what happened was Tai Chi had reached out to me, and then he said, "Hey, we should meet," because he lived nearby, myself in the Chicago suburbs. And when he invited me to go hang out at a bar, he's like, meet me at a bar, we'll have a drink, we'll talk about politics or whatever. I actually remember, like, I told my wife, I said, I'm going to go meet this guy. I don't know him, at a bar. So I'm going to Downers Grove, which is like the next town over, just so you know, in case I don't come back. I made some kind of joke like that. It's like, he goes, see you later. I'm meeting some guy. And she's like, who's the guy? I go, I don't know. I really don't know. Like, he just a guy I met online, I think at that point, I don't think I had spoken with him, like we had texted back and forth several times and talked about the party and so forth. But we met in person. And it was absolutely fantastic. And I consider him like my godfather, my sponsor into the party, because he brought me in. And, through our great conversation, he invited me immediately into the state committee, which had an opening. Someone had dropped out and they had been long looking for someone to fill that person's space. And so I joined the state committee, and I think we had two meetings, like one pretty soon after that to appoint me officially into the state group. And then I think we had one more like a month later. 2016, Mike Maturin and Juan Munoz had run for a president, vice president in that race. And the party was kind of in its infancy. It was the Christian Democratic Party back in, like, I think 2012 is when it first launched. And but they had reorganized around 2016 into the American Solidarity Party. And it was kind of fledgling. It had a couple, maybe 200-300 dues paying members at that time. And I think Mike was on the ballot in a couple states where it was really easy to get on the ballot, and write in several other places. But he had Facebook posts, and Facebook was huge at the time. So the party had a lot of momentum in that time, where the algorithm was much friendlier to other spaces than the big people with money, essentially, is what it comes down to nowadays. So after that, which has been cyclical and repetitive in the party, is that there was obviously a lot of energy for 2016, and then the energy went down. There were a lot of people that thought the party was going to take off into the stratosphere, and it didn't quite happen. In 2017, 18, in that kind of swing phase, people are trying to chart a new course, right? And some of the folks that had kind of gained into leadership had some professional background in Republican and Democratic spaces, and and I'm taking this not from anything that anyone said. When I joined the national committee in 2018, I saw like a lot of their documents. Like we had our Google Drive, and there were lots of documents about forward facing plans. Like, okay, in the next year, we're going to raise, several $100,000, and we're going to, do this, and we're going to run 50 candidates and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of the focus was on just messaging. Like if we just kind of like, if you build it, they will come, right?
Mhm.
And the problem was that there was a lot of dreaming going on in that time and not much doing. First of all, that was like, in my opinion, that was a big issue. Was their Facebook posts being made, but all of it was very, very aspirational. Nothing was like concrete. And then the second thing that kind of drew me in and why I ran for national committee was there was a kind of a rift between a very progressive leaning crowd and then people that were more conservative leaning, basically on social issues. The mindset like of the progressive folks was like, there's all these people out there that they're okay with these progressive issues, and we just need to go get them. And I think the folks that I aligned with were like, you're crazy, right? Like there isn't this huge group of people that is that progressive on social issues, and yet, you know, kind of where we are in the rest of our political space, like
Mhm.
pro-life, again, would be the big
Right.
thing. I think
Right.
that was the issue that resonated with me more than anything else. And I'm like, there are progressive pro-life people. You started off with your first interview with a fantastic progressive pro-life person, and I think those people should be welcome in our spaces, right? But it's not like that crowd is huge. Skipping half the story and getting to where we currently are, I also don't think there are millions of people who are super, super conservative socially and also pro life and want to have a distributist economy, a worker based economy, the people who are like very overtly green in their sense of environmental issues and
Mhm.
strive for peace and harmony in the world. Like, I don't think
Mhm.
that group exists either. Right. And I think that's kind of the way we've tilted. And that's kind of common, as you know, as a political buff and someone that understands how history has worked, is that there's always a pendulum.
Right.
And for me, it was, my election to the national committee, and then I was elected vice chair when I first joined the committee, and I was chair the second year. And I think a lot of that and kind of the success that I had in early party politics was that my mindset has always been to be extremely nerdy. I'm only a steward, like from the Lord of the Rings. Like I'm a steward of Gondor, right?
Mhm.
Like I am not. We're waiting for real people to come in that have political chops to take, you know, control and really lead the party into national recognition. Like I'm not the person to do that. I'm a math teacher. I'm a parent. I have no running a party background, even at the local level.
Yeah.
And to think that, that I have the skill set and the professional background to do that is ridiculous. But what I did strongly believe is that there's a lot of work to get done. There's things that need to happen. And this was where I looked at the crew that was in at 2018. They had a bunch of dreams, right? It was like,
Mhm.
oh, like this would be great if this happened, this happened. We got all these whale donors and we had all these candidates running, like everything would just take off and people would know who we are and we'd be able to, shoot for the moon. And, when I left chair, when I stepped down from chair in 2020 and the just fully focused on the Carroll campaign for the rest of that year, in my farewell address, I said, and this is not my words. I saw this somewhere and I thought it was very powerful. Is that a dreamer is someone that can look at something that's non-existent and kind of picture it, right? You can kind of set that dreaming, look at it and go, oh, that'd be great. But a visionary is someone who takes a dream and makes it into reality, takes
Mhm.
all the steps in between where we are now and where that dream ends up, and says these are the concrete steps that need to occur in order for that dream to become a reality. And I said if we want to be successful, we need to all be visionaries, right? We need to be people who take the dreams that we have and actually do the work, that gets us from point A to point B. That's kind of where my work in the national committee and in the Carroll campaign really kind of solidified kind of where I was in the party, right? The nice thing about, I mean, COVID was not a nice thing, but the plus side of COVID was I had so much time to work on the Carroll campaign. I mean, I might have been working 40 hours a week, on the campaign. And that was when school was in session, because during COVID, we were not physically in session. And we had our Zoom calls and we had our other obligations professionally, but those were capped. Like we couldn't do more than that for students, like in a meeting space. Like you just could not meet with students. It wasn't considered unhealthy for them to do more stuff. So I had a really wide open time block to be doing the work that we did in the Carroll campaign.
That's a great segue into how you wound up on the Carroll campaign. And, I would love to hear a little more about what it's like to run for vice president as just a regular person. As you say, you're a math teacher. You're not a politician. You're not, someone who would typically be a person you would think of as running for vice president. So what was it like personally? What was it, what was the work like? But how did you, first off, how did that come about? How I've heard the story, but probably many people have
Yes,
not.
right.
So
The story for
I'd love to
fans,
hear
yeah,
that.
exactly. The backroom comedy of how you become a vice presidential candidate. So I was the chair of the party. Brian Carroll went through a formal process of primary discussions. We had debates that ran up to a convention, a presidential convention. I think that was in 2019 in the fall. Maybe November is, I think, when we actually nominated Brian. And Josh Perkins was one of the people that he was running against, along with Joe Schreiner. And Josh was very energetic in the primaries, like in the debates and so forth. And I think he and Brian had spoken. Josh had said, if I'm not chosen, if you're chosen, I would love to be your vice presidential candidate. And Brian had said the same to Josh. When Brian got nominated, Josh, they had that conversation like, okay, so like, are you going to be my vice presidential candidate? And Josh went to his employer and said, hey, I'm considering doing this with the American Solidarity Party. And the employer came back with, well, you're going to need to take a leave of absence in order to do that, right? Because the commitment seems like it's going to be a pretty big deal. He's like, well, it's really not that big a deal. And Juan Munoz had said, like, it's not, you're the vice presidential candidate is really nothing. I mean, your name on a piece of paper,
Sure.
and you could do more than that if you want, but that's the requirement. But his bosses said, no, you're going to have to take a leave of absence. And he's like, I can't do that. Right.
Right.
And so then Brian was back to square one, and we had a whole boatload of other people that he talked to and asked, and, I can go through some names, but it's really irrelevant. Like no one else could, take on the task, right? For whatever reason. And so, I was still chair of the party, and Brian and I talked about his vice presidential candidate, and he was concerned. He's like, I can't get anyone, right, to take on the role, and we need somebody. And so I kind of came up with names, and we'd brainstorm, and these are several conversations over weeks, right? Maybe a month had gone by since his nomination, and we hadn't wrapped it up. And so, I thought, and I was just being nice in passing to say, well, if you can't find somebody another week, maybe I'll do it. Right. He's like, oh, you would? I said, I mean, I'd love to, I'd be happy to, but let's just look around. Right. Like keep asking. And so I tease him still to this day that I don't think he asked anyone after that. I think that was like, okay, I'll just wait a week and then we'll have it done. And he goes, that may or may not have happened. It's like, it's just funny. And so he did. He's like, I couldn't get anybody else. And I said, all right, well, let me first of all clear this with the tower, as it were. And so I asked my wife, this is the situation, and Brian needs somebody, and I would consider it, but what do you think? She says, do I have to do anything? And I said, no. And she's like, okay, well, that's fine. So, and you've met my wife, so you know that that's very much kind of in her kind of style of looking at things. I said, okay, so I called Brian. I said, all right, my wife says it's cool, but let me check with work, because that's what the sticking point was with, Josh. And I went to my principal and I said, here's the situation, right? And she's like, that's cool. The only thing is that you just can't bring it into school, right? Like you can't talk about it in class, and it can't become something that can be contentious or is going to cause problems in the workplace. I said, no problem, right? And so, a longer story on a quick version on that end is I actually never told anyone at work. that I was running for
Yeah.
office. Maybe like a couple of my closest friends I knew that would never say anything to anyone. I say, hey, just so you know, like I'm running for vice president with this thing that I'm doing. And there was only the people that knew I was involved in the ASP
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
I told. And they're like, no way, that's cool, whatever. I go, yeah, but just don't tell anybody. I'm like, I talked to the principal and she said, don't mention this or whatever. I said, that's fine. So the way that people found out at work was I was on the ballot in Illinois, and they saw my name on the ballot, and then they came to that's in November of 2020, and so I was pretty much a whole year the vice presidential candidate, and they found out, like, why didn't you tell us? I said, I was told that like this can't be a thing, and I just don't want to take any chances, right?
Sure.
So, what's fun is still now it's 2025. I still have students because the other teachers know too, right? Like
Yeah.
they found out
Yeah.
and everyone knows about it. So, I'll have students ask me. It's always comes up first. Did you run for president? I said no, and then they're like, I don't correct them. I just say no, and then they have to come back with like, oh, was it vice president? I'm like, yes, it was. So that was one version of one part of it was the school part. The ballot part was very interesting because like I went through all this work, and really my mindset was I'm supporting Brian. He's the one that's really taking most of the heavy lifting because he's traveling. He would travel to Louisiana, traveled to Texas, traveled to Arizona, was in the Midwest, came to Chicago. And so I'm trying to be supportive of him. I did a couple of interviews in different locations, partly as chair of the party, but some vice presidential interviews. But like it was really wild going into the ballot box and seeing my name on the
Sure.
ballot. Like I voted in person. And I actually like I teared up. I was like, wow, like it became so real. And you'd think it would have been real all along, but it wasn't until that moment where I'm like, this is real. Like, this is happening. So that was fun. I mean, a lot of questions from friends, and I think I hadn't really planned on the answer, but the best answer that I could provide, I played in a softball league night. And we're sitting around chatting after a bunch of us, like maybe 6 or 7 of us, we're chatting, after in the parking lot. And one of my friends is like, so what are you doing again? Because he hadn't really heard the story from me. I'm running for vice president. It's like of the United States. I said, that's the only thing I could think of where that applies, like that running for it. And he's like, why? you know? And I go, like sometimes you just kind of have to take a stand for something. And the conversation we had, like we didn't get into political issues so much as one of the things that resonated with me throughout the whole process that I really rested on is that, I believe in freedom, but I also believe in responsibility, right?
Yeah.
And I think that a big problem with kind of our culture and with our politics is that people do not balance those two things in an appropriate way. That you have a set ability to be free in the United States, but like you're always bound by responsibilities. No one lives life free, you know. And this friend of mine, I'd known him for many, many years. I knew that, I knew his wife, I know his kids. And I said, like, for example, he's a golfer, right? I said, you wouldn't go to the store and just go buy a brand new set of golf clubs, right? Or you wouldn't go to the car dealership and buy a brand new car and go home with it and say, hey, I bought this $1,000, $2,000 set of golf clubs or this $25,000 car or whatever, and tell your wife that. Like, that would be insane. Like, I know you would
Yeah.
never even consider doing that. He's like, right,
Yeah.
absolutely not. She'd kill me, right? And I said, right, because, you have the freedom to make those purchases. We live in a country where there's golf clubs available at multiple different stores that you can stop at on the way from your place of work to your house, right? There's multiple car dealerships that offer cars that would gladly sit down with you and sign some kind of financing situation, right? And your credit card will take care of the golf clubs. And you could do that. There's nothing legally stopping you from doing that, right? But you have a sense of responsibility to your wife and your children and their futures that you wouldn't just go make that purchase, right? And I said, but we live in a country where politicians of both stripes make those transactions all the time,
Yeah.
right? And they claim their own, whichever freedom that they, the freedom of money versus the freedom of body. They don't even stop to consider the consequences of their actions in the future to society, right? To our children, to our children's children. and to the dynamics of how politics works. I think to myself, someone's got to fix that. And honestly, why not me? And he actually really liked that answer. Is in not that he's like, well, I wouldn't do it, but like, God bless you for doing it. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like, personally, that was where I was at that time. I spent a lot of time on Twitter at the time, Facebook, and creating lots of social media for Brian and just kind of responding to things on social media. It was an exciting time. Like my Facebook friend group went from like a couple hundred people to about 4,000 people. Everyone was, when I was on different things, like sending me friend requests. Funny quick side story, like my birthday was a couple of days ago, and I'm still getting birthday messages from people I don't know. And so when I get a happy birthday, I'm sorry to anybody out there that sent me a happy birthday. If I don't know you, I just went to profile and put unfriend, and not spitefully. It was just like, I don't know who you are, And so I'm trying to kind of cull those things that aren't people that I have no knowledge of.
Yeah.
But thanks for the birthday wishes.
Well, Amar, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. Again, really appreciate you and all that you've done to bring people in to these kind of conversations and get people engaged. So, again, thank you for your time and for your service.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Thank you again to Amar Patel for being my guest. You can find a link to the Illinois Solidarity Party Facebook page in the show notes. I have also provided links to several YouTube videos featuring both Amar and Brian Carroll. I also want to say I'm deeply grateful to Ford Fischer of News to Share for the use of his original footage of Rescue Resurrection. Ford is an Emmy-nominated independent news videographer, editor, filmmaker, and the editor-in-chief of News to Share. His work has been included in Oscar, Emmy, and Golden Globe-winning films. He co-founded and designed newstoshare.com as an engine for independent videographers and citizen journalists to contribute to the evolving news cycle. Ford is available for hire as a freelance videographer and journalist. You can reach him at fordfischervideo@gmail.com. That's FORDFISCHERVIDEO@gmail.com. To check out Ford's work, head to newstoshare.com. That's NEWS, the number 2, SHARE.com. You'll find a link to Ford's full Rescue Resurrection story in the show notes. There, you can also find more footage from the rescue at the Memphis Planned Parenthood, as well as the complete footage from the opening of Rescue Resurrection's new training facility in Memphis. As always, you can follow me on all social media platforms by heading to my website, votevicusa.com, or by heading to my Linktree, linktree.com/votevicusa. This week, we'll have extended portions of my interview with Amar, as well as my take on this week's congressional vote on healthcare policy on Substack and Patreon. To get bonus episodes and even more members-only perks, head to patreon.com/votevicusa or votevicusa.substack.com. Your generous support of our show helps keep the lights on and the cameras rolling. Please share this show, like and subscribe, ring the bell for notifications on YouTube, and leave a positive review wherever you find us online. Your interactions help more people find our content, so thank you. Until next time, Unorthodoxers, you stay faithful.